Hi, guys. Good morning, and welcome back to another episode of Season 3 Death in Cambodia Life in America. As always, I am always thinking about you listeners first and bringing you guys the education from the experts that we all want to hear. Today, we have an incredible guest. I'm so excited to have him on. His name is Dr. Patrick Heuveline, and he is a PhD professor in the Department of Sociology and the International Institute at UCLA, and the Associate Director of its California Center for Population Research. Dr. Patrick has his PhD from University of Pennsylvania and postdoctorate from Princeton, and has done lots of research in the long-term consequences of the Khmer Rouge regime. Many of his studies involve childhood family structures and the effect of child well-being and the transition into adulthood. So I already know from this description that this guy is going to give you a lot of information that I feel like a lot of us second generation have had questions about. Dr. Patrick, it is an honor to have you. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Dorothy. Thanks for the introduction and the invitation. I'm really excited to be part of the podcast. I really think this is very exciting that you open this dialogue, hopefully in many families, about what happened and what the long-term consequences of what happened in the late 70s might be both in Cambodia and in diaspora.
Right. So to get started, Dr. Patrick, you are a sociologist. You work in the Department of Sociology. Can you quickly just define for us what the job and the role is of a sociologist for our listeners?
Right. Sociology is one of several social sciences, basically trying to explain human behavior and social human behavior. Particular perspective of sociology is to look at the social determinants of behavior, to argue that we are societies structured in groups, we have organization, institutions, so how we behave on a daily basis is in part structures and constrained by this social world in which we are.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And you have a lot of focus on Cambodia. I've seen your papers, and you really do seem to have a passion for the Khmer Rouge. How did you fall into this space? Why the Khmer Rouge? Why are you studying it?
So I have a passion for Cambodia that I developed through a stay in Cambodia in the early 1990s, and if you're interested in Cambodia today, I think you have to study the Khmer Rouge because it was such a dramatic period, but also had such a lasting influence. At the same time, I think most of my work is actually trying to detail and describe what are exactly the consequences for the Khmer Rouge today. So there might be a tendency, even for many years, at least there was this tendency to attribute everything to the Khmer Rouge, mm-hmm. right? So there's prostitution in Cambodia, so there's poverty, and everything can be traced to the Khmer Rouge, and it's not entirely true, as we know. There's many other countries where there are violence, prostitution, poverty that has experienced that. So I would say most of my work has been trying to say, okay, this is really consequences of what happened, and these are things could have also have turned out differently because we have had now 44 years since the Khmer Rouge left. So I think precisely as a sociologist trying to understand the influence of history, of institution on individual behavior, try to disentangle a bit the two. What can we really trace and attribute to the Khmer Rouge regime?
Right. And from your papers, what have you found are kind of the top contributors and the top effects of the Khmer Rouge?
Well, so there are many, and it depends a little bit on the generation that you're looking at. Mm-hmm. So my first when I started the project, and I'm gonna say I for as a shorthand expression very often, but as all the work I've done with has been in collaboration with researchers in Cambodia. So I should really say we,
Sure.
but I don't want to sound like the royal we. So I started actually to develop this project with a team at the Royal University of Phnom Penh in social sciences. Most of them were in the Department of Geography, some in psychology, some in sociology. And what we first identified as a topic of interest that was in the late 1990s, about 20 years after the Khmer Rouge, and it was centered on family, which is my primary interest, and how family reconstructed themselves for people who had been. We were already adults during the Khmer Rouge. With those, especially those who had started a family, they had married, they had maybe children, and they lost possibly some of their own children, some lost their spouse. How did they reconstruct their family? And the reason we started this was we knew that in the 1980s there was something like a baby boom in Cambodia. There was a very large number, and it was very clear if you travel there in the 1990s that you look, there were so many kids under the age of 15. And it also has to do that in Cambodia, you tend, especially in rural Cambodia, you tend to see the children out much more than you would probably in an American environment. So we try we wanted to describe this and also to try to understand it, how this generation that had been affected in what we call in demography, in sociology, the family construction years, where you grow your family, you marry, you have children, how this generation was affected and how they reconstructed themselves to the extent they could. So so that's, for that generation, we did find that many of them had more children than generation before. Were not we were not in a position to really say anything about a causal effect, but there was really at the collective level a reconstruction of a replenishment of the population after such traumatic losses.
That seems very, very counterintuitive. You would think if you had survived something as horrific as the genocide and you had seen the way the children were attacked and this horrible thing that you just survived, I could only assume if I was in that position, I wouldn't feel the want to have children after that. But it seems that there was a surge.
There definitely was a surge, yeah, and we interviewed mostly women of this in this generation. We don't really have a psychological explanation for this. Even the participant didn't really have an explanation, at least not one that would center on intention. A lot of women we interviewed said, well, we at that time we were just having children, like they were coming. So sometime even two in the same year, which is hardly possible. I guess it is with
Right.
a 9 months pregnancy, but a lot of women basically expressed that they were not making any plans to have more children or to have fewer, but there was also an increase in marriages. So, well, a number of widows of a certain age never remarried, but most men and most women who were not yet married in also very high proportion just after. And then, so yeah, I'm not saying it was a conscious decision, but that it happened. And I think at the collective level, it may make sense that there are a lot of empty houses and available land in an agricultural society, and that there is. It's not so much that there is an intention to have more births, but all the factors that usually limit a little bit um, childbearing, because there's some constraint on people cannot get married because they don't have access to a land to cultivate and become independent from their parents. all these factors tend of disappear at that time. So it might not be fully, volitional, but it's the effect we find at the aggregate level.
Right.
And maybe, and here I'm speculating, but maybe I understand your intuition, but also maybe there's a need to move on, to leave death behind and to move on to life and childbearing and reproduction, and that's maybe one of the way to do it.
Right.
And this is something, interestingly, this is something, I mentioned we were thinking initially what happened to people who lost, a couple who lost children and so on. We also see that for, actually that wasn't really a factor that of childbearing decision either. So we find this increase in marital fertility, whether couples had lost children or not. And even for those who married, who were, too young to be married before the Khmer Rouge and married just after. So young couples also had kind of this experiences, high, elevated childbearing levels in the 80s. And that lasted almost 10 years. So the 80s was a small period of high childbearing.
Right. And I know that you specialize in studies of Cambodians in Cambodia. Have you noticed the same trend about Cambodians who had gone throughout different diasporas, for example, Australia, France, and the US?
No, this is not something I've followed, so I'm not sure. I'm not sure if refugees had larger families as well. That I'm not aware, and that would be that's a good. You think as a researcher, I like the comparison, because that would be a way of knowing if the environment, what was the effect of context and having, like what I mentioned, a lot of empty space and both physical land and housing and so on.
Right.
So it's not my impression, but I might be wrong because I haven't studied that.
Right. So going back to the original question, the effects that you have seen of the Khmer Rouge, we have talked about the baby boom that we noticed right afterwards. What other things did you notice that have trickled from the Khmer Rouge?
Right. So for that generation. So next we were interested in the generation of children. So I've talked mostly so far about the parents.
Mm-hmm.
Those who were adults had started a family, but not completely, finished with their reproductive years, and then we studied the more the younger generation. Those were either children or even conceived around the time of the Khmer Rouge, and we were interested in the long-term effect of losing a parent during that time. So if sociologists often talk about the life course perspective, where you have some defining events, especially adverse childhood events that affect you at the time, but also have a kind of a long tail, long effect. And this is increasingly things that social scientists and health scientists find, that you have something in childhood, but it might only manifest itself as chronic disease, cardiovascular disease when you're 40 or 50.
Mm.
So we are interested in this, and this is actually something I'm working on still now, because it takes a lot of time between data collection and data cleaning and data analysis. To research at its own pace, and it tends to be pretty slow. So I have some results that not yet published, but they've been peer reviewed, that suggest that there's been some long-term consequences. And for this, we know, I think, a little bit more, especially when we look at mental health. I think we know a little bit more about this effect in the diaspora than we do in Cambodia, because people who immigrated to Australia, France, the US, and had traumatic experience were often diagnosed as suffering from either depression or PTSD, because they were in contact with Western medicine. Until recently, there was very little of that in Cambodia. So there was a mental health study about 10 years ago, and now there's more and more people who are working in Cambodia to address this issue. And there is a very high, we know there's a very high prevalence of those mental health conditions.
Right, right. And so for the first generation, you had noticed the effects of just kind of a big boom, a baby boom. And for the second I don't know if we want to call it second generation, maybe 1.5. That's the terminology that's being used because
That is, yes, yes.
people who were born in the camps or right around the time when the Khmer Rouge had kind of disintegrated. So in 1979, people who were born around that period, they're calling it 1.5. You're just noticing that those are experiencing the effects of potential higher rates of depression and anxiety in mental health. What about the survivors themselves? Have you been able to study beyond just the baby boom? What were some of the other effects that you've seen come when it comes to the survivors?
Yeah, so when we looked at some of the mental health condition, we were interested in that generation, but we looked across generations. So I think one of the things was quite expected is that if you were already an adult during the Khmer Rouge, you were more exposed, you had more traumatic experiences, you were more likely to have been deprived in some way, to have faced life-threatening experiences, to have maybe even witnessed murder or of a loved one, and so on. So that was pretty much our expectation. We confirmed that. It's very sobering, but we confirmed very high level. I mean, of this experience, up to about more than half of the people we had in the sample experienced some form of deprivation, and that only goes up with for that generation. What was maybe more surprising, especially when we looked at the symptoms of depression, anxiety, also very high. More than half of our population had some symptom of anxiety, and maybe 40% have symptom of depression. So we do find this is more prevalent in that older generation that went through the Khmer Rouge, especially as adults, rather than as children. But we still find fairly high level. It tapers off, but not that much, not that quickly for the younger generation. And this is not something this is something I want to work on some more. This is not something I have a good explanation yet, but I think it is consistent with a lot of the literature on the intergenerational effect, intergenerational transmission of traumatic experience. People who grow up with parents who have PTSD. So there seem to be quite a high level of exposure to violence in the home. We know there's high interpartner violence in Cambodia. And children are often report that they're being physically disciplined by their parents and so on. So I'm not sure. I mean, it's an hypothesis at this point. I have not completely connected the dots, but the result was kind of surprising that the level of potentially traumatic experiences is still among the generation that was born after 79. It's still fairly high.
Right, right. Going to the different papers that you have written, you have done, again, so much research in Cambodia. I want to ask you, if you can pick your top 3 or even 2 papers that you think would our listeners would have to read, or we'd like them to read, in terms of learning something about the effects of the Khmer Rouge. What are those 2 papers?
Well, so I think one is the first one is I've just somewhat described to you, which is I call it the phoenix population. I'm using this image of the phoenix that sort of rebirths from its ashes, right? So there was a very high level of mortality during those 4 years, and then the population rebounded through this baby boom that I've described, and I found it fascinating. I still at the descriptive level, still have, as I mentioned, a lot of questions on how it happened. We don't really know why, but we observe this, and we observe this in other in other population too that are exposed to war and genocide, that there is this at the population level there is this replenishment, there is this rebound, and that people participate in afterwards, right?
Really?
Right. So, but it's I think the what happened in Cambodia is a bit unique. But you might well, we also talk in the U.S. about the baby boom, the post-war baby boom. But often after a war, the baby boom is a very short-lived um, phenomena for a couple of years, and you can explain it almost in mechanical way, if I can use this term. The couples are separated for a few years, and the boys come back home, and the family have a first or next child very soon after. But that's usually only for a year or two after the end of a separation. And in Cambodia, it was a more lasting thing. So um, we look at it as a society that was at rich or really high, was in crisis at the faced almost an existential threat. There was a lot of also questioning about what happened in Cambodia. Why did what made it very unique and maybe harder to process for many people is that it's not like the genocide in Germany. You don't have an enemy coming in and killing people, or at least another group that is easily identified. It was for a lot of people that I talked to was struggling with this idea of why did Khmer kill Khmer? Why did that happen to when people were killing their own people? So again, this is more of a questioning than a line of questioning and puzzle that I find interesting than providing final answers
Right.
to this. The While we were researching this, we had an experiment. I kind of stumbles on something that I knew existed, but hadn't really spent a lot of time on this. It's this issue of so-called forced marriages, right? So we know more because the Documentation Center of Cambodia has spent some time on this. We know that a bit more about the phenomenon. There's a few pictures, and there's a lot of oral testimony of people who got married during the Khmer Rouge, not as was traditionally the case in Cambodia through a matchmaker and parents agreeing to marry their offspring, the bride and the groom, but basically through a group ceremony where maybe 20 couples were pulled together from their work shift, and within 1 hour they were married, and then sometime even went back to work the same day. And during I'm mostly a quantitative sociologist, so I work mostly through qualitative surveys with large number of people, but I always like to start with some focus group discussion where my Cambodian collaborators and we articulate a little interview guide, maybe like you did in preparation of our interview, and then we ask people, a group of 10, 20 people to chime in, and so we can have a sense of whether we're asking the right question or if we're off to a tangent or something. And so we were interested in talking about baby boom. So before that, we were interested in talking about marriages. How did you get married after the Khmer Rouge? What happened? How young were you? How did you pick your partner? What are the important factors in picking one? And then this woman in this particular group, she did mention that she was married under the Khmer Rouge, and she recalled this kind of chilling exchange she had with her mom, where her mom, she didn't want, so the Khmer Rouge cadre came to her house and told her to get married to one of them, and she was crying. She was telling her mom, "I don't want to do this," and her mom basically told her, "Well, you don't really have a choice here. You have to do it, and then after the war, after the Khmer Rouge, maybe we can reassess, but for now, you have to do it." So that really triggered our curiosity, and we asked her, so what happened after the Rouge? How did that end? And she did say that she was still married to that man, and he was actually a good person, and they had children, and we started to wonder how common that was. How common was it to actually stay married with someone who you basically someone picked for you, and you didn't know one day, and the next day you were married to? I think there's some TV shows that kind of document this now, married at first sight, and things like this. But for us at the time, that was very unusual and sounded very unlike the view of the Western view of marriage. So that other article we call "Do Marriages Forget Their Past?" because it seemed that the fact that we're married under this condition didn't really have an impact. Of course, there was some divorce, like in any other cases, but it wasn't. We didn't see a higher rate of divorce than we did in other couples that were married just before or just after the Khmer Rouge. Of course, as quantitative sociologists or demographers, we look at divorce rate. It doesn't tell us anything about happiness. People might be unhappy and stay married, but that's also true of people who got married after or before. So what we find was that this was not, at least at the population level, that wasn't really something that created higher rates of separation. Of course, we know that at the individual level, there were some couples were separated, and it was traumatic for some. But at the population level, it didn't seem to be quite large effect. Now, you have to put that in context of mostly marriages that were mostly arranged at the time, just before 75 or after 79, by parents, and even those, it wasn't uncommon for a woman to meet her husband on the day of her wedding. She would trust that her parents had made the selection in a way that was beneficial for her, but so I think that maybe also explained why it wasn't that different. There was already a culture of arranged marriages, but still we found it very very interesting, and we dug a little bit on this and on the way that people thought of their marriage as not something where maybe like in the West you're madly in love at the beginning and that carries you for the rest of your life, but as uh, something maybe a bit more pragmatic, where you don't really know the person at first, but then you're going to get to know the person, especially during the Khmer Rouge. If you go through a lot of hardship together and you pull through, and then you gain respect, maybe even we can call it love, as you progressed for that person. So that was interesting for us. That was both because it was unexpected, but also, but I think because it told us something about the culture in Cambodia that was very different from our uh, approach to partnering in the U.S.
Right, right. What about children? Now we're trying. I know we discussed a little bit about the marriage, but what about the effects of the Khmer Rouge in terms of children, raising the children, family structures within, well, family structures, and how the parents who had survived navigated a family structure and their perspective on family afterwards.
Right. So this is where it gets really difficult to attribute causal effect to the Khmer Rouge, because what happened about 10 years, 12 years after the Khmer Rouge was the Paris the agreement, peace agreement in Paris. Then the UN came to supervise some election, and then the economy was completely open to foreign capitals in ways that it wasn't before. So Cambodia was very isolated because it was together with Vietnam was isolated from the West until the mid 1990s. Became really part of the global economy, and many factories opened in Cambodia that did garments, shoes, and so on. So there was a very quick catch up and transformation of the economy, but also of the social fabric. You can imagine, as traditionally, women until they got married lived very close to their parent under close supervision. Virginity is very much expected at marriage, and so there was a lot of fear of women becoming pregnant before marriage, or just getting a bad reputation for not behaving the way that was according to tradition, and so on. So now, almost over, I wouldn't say overnight, but over the maybe a decade, you have a society, you have really a sea change where it's almost expected that a large proportion of women would go to the city and work in those factories, and come back and make some money, and maybe come back with some money for their own marriage, and maybe for their parents. So now it's become this is where we can, for example, when we look at the transformation of marriage. So marriages, I described marriages before, just after the Khmer Rouge, as being mostly traditionally arranged, with very low rate of separation. Well, there has been quite a change. Now, so-called romantic marriage is more common, where partners find each other and decide to get married. There's an increase in the rate of divorce as well. But as much as we can see, this has more to do with the way the Cambodian society has been transforming in the past 20, 30 years or so, than really with the long-term consequences of the Khmer Rouge. So there are some. So as I mentioned, there is still, I think, a generation that has been affected by trauma. There's some intergenerational transmission there. There's some domestic violence that does probably most likely contribute to rates of divorce. But there's also all this other societal transformation that's taking place at the same time. And it's a little bit hard sometimes to tease out those effects.
Right. Have you noticed and compared these effects with what had happened post-Holocaust? Now, granted, from my understanding, there were no forced marriages in the Holocaust, so I know that already makes the Khmer Rouge different. And I also do know, as the point that you had mentioned previously, this is Khmer people versus Khmer people. So I'm curious on if you've ever kind of compared the two post genocides, and if the effects are similar or if they're different.
Yeah, so this is not something I've done formally. What we do with my collaborators before we start on the research ideas, that we see what's in the literature, and we look at the different experiences, what has been reported. So, for example, I mean, a lot of the literature on post-traumatic syndrome and depression, the effect of genocide, has roots in the study of survivors of the genocide in Europe in the 40s. But I haven't really engaged in paired comparison. We also drew on studies of, let's say, for example, of children in Rwanda also that were exposed to. So unfortunately, history provides us with several examples, and we can often. I try we try to compare results, but not really in a way where we are doing a paired study where we can really ask the same question in different settings. And I think that would be really interesting. But it takes, even just for one setting, like where it takes so much time and investment to find the funding, to find the local partners, and so on, that it might not be quite feasible yet. But I think the research design that I think that I would find the most exciting is the one you mentioned, where we would do a study that would be similar for Cambodian in Cambodia and for Cambodian outside, maybe in the US or in another country, and see whether the process of reconstruction, rehabilitation has been, how it has been shaped by the differences in their environment.
Right. The people in Cambodia now, it has been 40, 45 years, 44 years since the Khmer Rouge. I I can only imagine how it would feel to be trying to heal in the very same country that the disaster happened. But looking at the data, are you able to conclude that the population is healing, and in what ways?
So I think it depends on what we're looking at. So I mentioned mental health, for example,
Right.
and there we found some that the healing was, as I mentioned, maybe slower than we expected. We almost thought there would be a before and after. So you either born before the Khmer Rouge and you never had to experience, and you lived through it, and you live through it. We hypothesized through at different ages, so that maybe had more of an effect at some on some people who were in their formative developmental years than others, and so on. So we expected a little variation there, but we really expected there would be a break. If you're born after '79, you didn't experience it yourself. And again, we didn't quite find that. We found that yes, you were less likely to have developed, experienced traumatic things and to have developed some somatic symptoms from it and depression and so on. But the rates are still very high. So this seems to be a fairly low process if you think of healing at the population level.
Right.
So you have you have a younger generation, the 1.5 and the second generation that you described, that is replenishing and replacing the older generation. That's part of the demographic renewal process, right? As the older generation dies off, and you have more people who are born after the Khmer Rouge. I don't know what the proportion is, but it's a very young population, so the proportion under age 45 must be quite high. It's definitely the majority. I think the median age is probably around 15 or 20. So
Right.
it's so now you have a large majority of people who've never directly experienced it, but they have indirectly experienced it because they have experienced it through their interaction with the older generation. So that's a slow process. There's something that changed more rapidly. So there's notable increase in the educational level, for example. So there was the majority of people before the Khmer Rouge, especially, I mean, the majority of women didn't have a complete primary education. There was a bit more higher education level for men, but it was still fairly rare to complete secondary schooling before the Khmer Rouge, and that has changed. And then during the Khmer Rouge, of course, formal education was completely abolished. And so this has been changing pretty rapidly. The enrollment rates are increasing rapidly. I think for children under the age of 15, they are in the order of 90%. There are higher rates of graduation. Again, we can't really. It's easy to have numbers about graduation enrollment. It's harder to really assess the content and how much people really student really learn in that graduate. But there's reason to be optimistic about rapidly increasing education level. The economy has transformed pretty rapidly as well. So the Cambodia has experienced rate of growth fairly high for now, about 30 years, I would say, often double digits. So there is really a lifting out of poverty of a substantial part of the population. I mean, most people are not, there's only a very small minority that's wealthy by international standard, but I think the proportion of the population that is kind of at almost striving to just put food on the table. I think that proportion has decreased, and so there's notable improvement there. They tend to be relatively quick.
Right. Again, it is hard to say whether that is the effect of the Khmer Rouge or if it's just time and technology passing by. I have heard from my father, at least from the times that he has gone back to Cambodia recently. He goes quite often, probably once a year at this point, to do business and whatnot, that he notices that the crime rate and the corruption in Cambodia currently is just through the roof. And maybe in compared to the other neighboring countries like Vietnam or even Laos, now this is totally his perspective, right? But he says that it's just the crime is outrageous there. And I think, again, it is always easy to kind of draw back and say, well, this is due to the Khmer Rouge, and this is because the people who had survived don't know how to rebuild their society, and they don't know how to do it without crime, because the Khmer Rouge was just a bunch of, you know, criminals taking over and us. And so, do you agree with that statement? Do you believe that?
So yes, to a large extent, I would say yes, but I don't have numbers. I don't know if there's really reliable crime statistics in Cambodia, but there is definitely a level of violence. When I mentioned the surprise that we had, that there's still a high level of exposure to traumatic events and rates of mental health disorders in the population that was born after. I mentioned some intergenerational effect, but I don't want to be blaming only the parents and domestic violence. So there is also a lot of violence in the society. I mean, there is crime. Um, there is crime that is maybe out of driven by poverty, but there's also crime that is because if you're very powerful in Cambodia, you have some form of immunity, I guess. And so, for example, just the experience of murder and deaths from unnatural causes, we had more than 10% of the population born after the Khmer Rouge who said they experienced that. We expected it would be very high for those who lived during the Khmer Rouge. We thought that was a common experience. And it was, I think, close to 20%, but still 10% of the people born after said they had witnessed murder, which we thought was really, really, really high. So there is still a high level of violence that people can observe in society. It's as I mentioned, it's economically it's developing, and it's if it is lifting all boats to some extent. I do believe even the most of the most of the population is living better now than they did 40 years ago. But if you're thinking of a counterfactual, it could be also much better. Probably, it's hard to see what doesn't happen, but the things have gotten better, but they almost had to because it started from such a low level 40 years ago,
Right.
And the fact that there was this Khmer Rouge period before there was this terrible time is almost giving a pass to the government, because basically whatever they do, it will always be better than it was before, and they don't have to do a lot for the population to really make people feel they were better. What they're so yes, they're doing things, but it maybe could have been a little bit more. The growth might have been distributed a bit better. There is, but to be fair, I mentioned the development of education, and I think that's important.
Right.
With the caveat that it's in principle free education, but it's actually not. Parents have to pay small fees for different things, and I say small fees from a foreigner perspective, but for many parents, it's a significant expense. The other thing that the government has done is to try to develop a safety net, which they basically wasn't. So they they issue ID poor cards, so which are basically on a need base, and that provide free healthcare and some other benefits. So it's going in the right direction. It's almost impossible to know. I guess it could have gone much faster. If you're a critic, you can maybe argue that, but it's really hard to know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
But what's clear too, just go back on what your father was saying from experience. It's clearly a country that has vast disparities
Right.
in economic situation and in also all forms of riot. There is definitely a large share of the population that feels disenfranchised. They don't really believe they have access to the court or to any. If they're being there's a lot of issues with land appropriation and
Right.
expulsion, and people feel they don't have any way to oppose it.
Right.
There have been some social movements. The people were quite courageous. Courageously try to organize and resist, but there's very little they can do.
Do you feel from a sociologist perspective that these are the biggest issues Cambodia and Cambodians in Cambodia are dealing with right now?
I think land is the biggest issue, whether it's land in urban settings where people who are, would maybe defined as squatters in our in our language, but that feel that they have the right to be there because they've been there for some time, but there was no formal titles and so on,
Right.
are being pushed away to make way to massive urban developments, or in the land in the agricultural sector, where there's also displacement of people to for concessions to big companies, rubber companies, and so on, or massive projects like the dam constructions
Mhm.
on the Mekong and so on. Yes, I think that's the main issue, that main source of dissatisfaction when people are opening up a little bit about frustration. It often has to do with land and
Right.
property rights or lack thereof.
You had mentioned we had talked a little bit about your papers on Cambodia and what your main focus is. We've also talked a little bit about this new paper that you're currently working on that is still in development on mental health. If you were to look at all the topics that you have been able to kind of pick at about Cambodia, what would you say is your main goal with your research on Cambodia?
That's a good good question. I think as we mentioned early on, I went to Cambodia early on. I decided I wanted to do research there to bring attention to some of the issues that people are dealing with. It's really one of the, I think, most dramatic. The 4 years of the Khmer Rouge are probably some of the most dramatic years any population has been subjected to, and I wanted to document that. I cannot build intervention. That's not my trade. I wish I could change things, but I'm in a different line of work, and I try to bring what I can to the table, which is to start with to try to document what has happened and what are the consequences even today. So this is why I went there, approached a team of social scientists over there. And said, what do you think is important? And we again we started with family, and then we thinking of, now there's more attention on mental health. I think mental health initially wasn't my main focus, but when you study anything else, I guess you have to think about what are the mediating effect of mental health on any other phenomena. If you're looking at education, you know that people who have suffered traumatic experience are not going to be able to focus on their study in the same way, and so on. So it became something that I had to educate myself about. I'm not a psychologist or psychiatrist by training at all, but it's something I decided to really research, to try to establish that as well, so that then I could maybe study other processes I'm more interested as a sociologist, whether it's marriage, childbearing, education, how people choose their profession, and all the other social phenomena that I'm interested in. So I'm about to wrap this up, and yeah, I think it was really really interesting to see that we have it's the effect of the marriage, at least at the individual level, on health, are much more widespread, not really limited to the generation of direct survivors of the Khmer Rouge than maybe I would have thought initially.
Right, right. And one other thing that we kind of touched on before was also the health, like physical um, effects that could be.
Mm.
And I
Right.
I know again we always talk about how it is hard to draw those lines together, but this is not the first time that I've heard about this topic being brought up, where like a lot of the trauma that has happened or happened from the Khmer Rouge could later on come out through different diseases and whatnot. And have you
Yeah.
done research on that? And what have you learned about that?
So we found a really high prevalence of both. So we asked a question. This is something that came up during the also some focus group discussion. So again, I try to educate myself about mental health, and I read about this particular depression and post-traumatic stress disorders. There are some standard questionnaire that are being administered. There's one that is called the Harvard Trauma Questionnaire, where it's basically a list of items. Do you feel? Do you have trouble concentrate? Do you feel this and that? How much you identify with some of the statement? And this has been validated across culture. There's actually a version of the Harvard Trauma Questionnaire that is designed to capture the experience of the Indo-Chinese refugees from Cambodia, Vietnam, and so on. So I read about this, and I was a little bit, and I also read some critique of that, right? So although there are some people who claim that PTSD is a universal human condition, and it can manifest itself across culture. You have people who criticize it on both sides. You have both some people worry that we will identify as a sign of mental poor health. Behavior that may be actually part of the cultural script for recovering from from healing from this experience. So the people have termed that cultural bereavement, where it's actually part of a collective expression and shouldn't be seen as problematic. On the other side, you have people who say, well, actually, there are people who are going to be missed if you apply Western categories, because the way they express their distress is different. So there's I don't know if you've come across the term BASBAT, which is a broken heart syndrome. The fact that you feel basically um, you're broken. I think broken heart sort of describe it. Your sort of lack of willing to move on because you're just broken in, in and feel very sad about things. So there was this sort of a theoretical level. I had some skepticism about those claims, and then when we went to the field, we started to ask some of these questions. We also had some. I have also had some doubts because we do interview and then post interview. We ask people, what did you think about this and this questionnaire? And there was a lot of people who say, I didn't really understand the differences we were asking about this and that,
Mm.
and so we were really not sure. So we then asked, well, how would you describe having being sad or being depressed, and so we had this question, just a simple question about how you feel today, that had like 5 categories. One being I'm good, thrown, I'm fine, and then the other one being I'm sad, and another one was I'm actually in pain, I'm suffering, and we find in the older generation, those who were born before 1960, more than half responded that they were either in physical pain, suffering, or in mental pain. And this was, I think, and those who said sad, actually, the proportion who said that they were sad purely in the mental way that maybe we construct as being sad, that prevalence, I think, was about 20%, was actually lower than the people who said they're depressed, that we identify, sorry, with our questionnaire as being likely to be probably depressed. So I think we think, to go back to your question, that indeed, I think some people express sadness, but for some other people, their trauma is expressing itself in other somatic ways, and they feel that they're in pain, they feel ill, but they may not identify it as a mental health issue. as I say, there's a development of mental health care in Cambodia. Some people are very admirably trying to make it a respectable part of medicine, and that the people can come and talk about the mental health issue. But this is still, I think, very early. I hope it's going to be more acceptable for the younger generation to have this dialogue about mental health and really have dialogues with therapeutic dialogues. But I think for the older generation, this is still uh, not something you do easily to talk about your mental health issue with
Right.
even with a doctor.
Right, right. No, this it's exactly what we are noticing, and I think that is exactly right. The point that you bring up is that we can't always just take the survivor's word for face value, because again, this idea of talking to a therapist is very, very a Western way of healing. I mean, let's be honest, it's not the way that the East uh, accepts as a way of healing. So yet maybe they may be questioning, why am I talking? Like, no, I don't feel sad. But then it can come out in other ways that that we don't really identify as depression, but we can identify that as physical uh, health concerns.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we do find this. We find, especially in the older generation, we find I would say that more than half of those that we are otherwise, through the questionnaire we have, which again is not perfect, but I think gave us the ballpark estimate of depression level and anxiety level. Maybe more than half of them are not really saying they're sad, but they rather say, "Oh, I have this back pain and I don't know why, and I'm always tired, so I can't really do this and so on." So things that may actually express, you're depressed, and the way we would maybe more easily identify as depressed, not wanting to get up and do things and be social and so on. But people don't really attribute that to a mental state, but more to a physical state. And again, this is something we do at the population level. We're not doing any diagnostic, so I can't really talk about any individual case where I say, okay, this is what's happening, particularly with this person. But there's such a high level of high proportion of people who don't recognize or don't really say they have they express they feel any sadness inside, but when you go through list of questions both about their physical activity and about some of the reason they don't do things, suggest that they do have some mental health sequela from what they have lived early on.
Right. What do you think is the solution to all this, if you have any?
I think if I had it, I would drop everything and I would go there and try to get all the money I can to address. I don't know whether solution. Again, I think that people who are going there, especially Cambodian psychologists and people who are Cambodian are really familiar with the Cambodian culture, who are going there and trying to change things about this, talking about. Uh, Mental health issues, and I think this is really really important. It's definitely part of the solution.
Mhm.
Um, I think not to flatter you, but I think people would try to initiate this type of dialogue that you're having with your dad within families. I think that's also has to be part of the long term solution. You can't really until you talk about these things, there's some awareness of this, of what happened and how it has affected people. It's harder to move on. I mentioned the progress of education, but again, didn't talk much about content. I think the schools could do more to teach really children about what happened in the not so distant past and may have affected their parents or grandparents. So probably some elements of a solution or something that would go in the right direction.
Yeah, yeah. No, the education part is definitely something that I also agree with. And I wonder if also it's because the country of Cambodia again, we talked a little bit about this before the call, but there is this silence that happens with this entire thing. Silence between Khmer Rouge survivor and children of Khmer Rouge refugees, and a silence about it in history, I feel personally in general. And do you know what the effects of that would be, this silence?
Well, I think a lot of the things we discussed today, really come from this. It's impossible, I think, for you and I to really know what it was like in '79 when on January 7 when things ended. How to move on with what has happened, and to try to decide, do you go after everyone who has been on the other side, and try to have violence. I'm sure. I've read before there were podcasts, there's a number of survivors' account of what happened in biographies and so on. So there's evidence that there was some kind of revenge killings, just after the fall of the Khmer Rouge, but not at a widespread, maybe hopefully not too widespread. And I think people had to decide, or society had to decide, how do we move on from that. And I think it's not for you and I to decide how to do it, because we really have no idea. And maybe at that time, silence was the best way, or at least try to move on and not really be confronted right away, was maybe the way to approach it. Now there's been a lot of documentation. So I think the ECCEC, the Extraordinary Course in the Chamber of Cambodia, has really done a lot of work to document what has happened, and I think that would be useful in the future. And again, I hope the education system picks up on that, and that becomes kind of part of the curriculum. I know that some people expressed disappointment about, there's been only 4 cases that have been to trial, and it was a lot of money, and so there's some questioning about, was it really worth it? But I think it is also part of the try to get to the truth, and eventually reconcile with what has happened. I think the documentation is probably more important than the actual prosecution of some 80, 90 years old survivors. So I think that's also something that is part of the solution.
Right. Well, I know that your work and your research is only contributing to that documentation. I hope to continue doing that as well for my community. Dr. Patrick, is there anything else that I am missing from your line of work? Any last words that you would like to share with our second generation community that I missed here in our interview?
Well, I don't think you've missed. We've been pretty comprehensive. I don't think we missed anything about my work, or at least I don't want this to be only about my work. But I think I would encourage your listener, assuming that most of them are second generation, or they're at least live part of diaspora, living abroad, to go back to Cambodia if they can, and see for themselves. There is likely. Some talent that they can bring, something that they can bring to the country, and I think they would find this. It would be useful, I think, but also they would find it rewarding, I think, to realize that they can contribute something. And most contributions are very, very small, mine as well, but they together they add up to something. They might add up to something significant. So I think it would be great if you have. I assume that you've sort of ignited some curiosity in your listeners about the home country, they can still call that. I hope they do take the trip. It's a long trip, but once you're there, it's it's still an awesome country with awesome people to meet. So
right. It's a long trip, but it's definitely worth it, isn't it?
Right. Have you yourself traveled back?
I have not since middle school, so I have yet to experience it as an adult, which may potentially do a trip end of November or October this year. So, um, especially since starting this project, I think it's only going to affect me more. Going back to the home country, just not only as an adult, but ever since I've really been starting this project and diving into this topic and my own family history. So, yeah, no, I am just as excited to plan that trip for myself to see what effect it has on me.
Great.
Yeah. Well, Dr. Patrick, thank you so much for sharing your breadth of knowledge with us. I know that my listenership is going to really just listen to this, if not listen to it twice, to really get to learn a little bit more about the data that have come from such a horrific event back in the 70s. For anybody who wants to find you, Dr. Patrick, is there any place that they can find you? Or if you don't want them to find you, that's fine too. But
Oh, well, I think I'm pretty easy to find if you go to the website of the UCLA's website, Department of Sociology. I'm one of the faculty members there, so you can find my page and also my email address, I believe.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for your time today, Dr. Patrick. We really, really appreciate it.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. Thanks for the invitation and the discussion. I enjoyed it.